8:30 in the morning, but it's really great to see all of you here, and I'm really excited about this topic. It's something that I'm passionate about and I've been working on for a long time, and I've had a lot of caffeine. And I think that hopefully you're passionate about this too, and I kind of want to try to get some information from you before we get started, do a little calisthenics, get warmed up in the morning. How many people here have downloaded Silverlight 4? One. And, oh, keep your hands up. And installed it. Okay, good. How many people have downloaded SharePoint 2010 and installed it? Hopefully no hands. 1, 2. Good. So that's a larger number than I thought. I mean, the SharePoint installation is quite large, and there's a pretty big README file to get started. But if you have any questions on that, I've done it a gazillion times in the last year, so just ping me if you have any issues with that. And so really the crux of this presentation is how do we bring those two things together? How do we bring SharePoint and Silverlight together in a way? So how many people here are Silverlight developers interested in bringing those skills to SharePoint development? And how many people here are SharePoint developers who are interested in learning more about Silverlight? It's about 50-50. It's interesting. So whenever I do this kind of talk, there's always half the crowd that's one or the other, just like we see here. And so there's part of the talk where I'm talking about Silverlight, and the Silverlight guys are like, yeah, we know this already. And then there's half the talk where I'm talking about SharePoint, and the SharePoint guys are like, yeah, we know this already. So just bear with me through those times. Hopefully we can weave together a story that seems interesting. So my name is Paul Stubbs. I'm a technical evangelist. I focus on SharePoint development out of the developer and platform evangelism team in Redmond. You can send me email at pstubbs@Microsoft. You can follow my blog. I have a lot of great information about both SharePoint development, Silverlight development, XNA development, whatever it may be. And also on Twitter, you can follow me if you want to. So with that, let's get started. So really there are two kind of things that I want you to walk away with this morning. I want you to really kind of get an understanding of the features of Silverlight and how they sort of map or integrate with the features of SharePoint and how those two things kind of come together. And then the second half, I want to really talk about the patterns or the sort of scenarios and how you would build, how do you get started with Silverlight on SharePoint? What are the entry points? I think you saw a lot of this in the keynote. The keynote had a great example with the race car demo where all of that was Silverlight running on SharePoint. And I believe that demo is running in the pavilion if you want to go see that demo again. But we're really going to talk about those things. How do the features fit together? And then how do I do these patterns on SharePoint? So let's start with Silverlight. And we're going to talk about kind of just the features that sort of map to SharePoint. So we think about Silverlight being a cross-browser and cross-platform plugin, which is exactly what SharePoint strives to be. SharePoint runs on Mac, it runs on Safari, it's supported on Firefox, it's supported on IE. So we have the cross-platform capabilities of SharePoint. SharePoint also has a mobile capability to display pages and sites on your mobile devices, just like Silverlight will in the future. And so you can see that the features of Silverlight map directly to those same goals that SharePoint has. Immersive experiences. This is really where Silverlight shines on SharePoint. The whole goal is to bring that immersive experience that Silverlight brings to SharePoint. I think we've all seen the out-of-the-box SharePoint site, and it leaves a lot to be desired, right? And this is where SharePoint and Silverlight can really come together and bring those experiences to life that users expect nowadays. Users have a higher expectation on what kind of features they are and how those experiences play out, and they don't see those on the out-of-the-box experience that SharePoint provides. And again, Silverlight is just .NET, just like SharePoint development is just .NET. And so once you've learned that skill set of .NET, it applies across Silverlight and it applies across SharePoint. So you can take those skills and develop solutions easily across both ways. The rich capabilities of data binding in Silverlight, coupled with the data services and the data capabilities of SharePoint as the platform, really come to light to make it easy to do these complex data binding scenarios, to create these applications against back-end systems like SAP or your SharePoint data very easily through data binding with very little code. Smooth streaming support. One of the things that users expect now is video, and so they look to SharePoint to host that video, to manage that video, to deal with that video. And so bringing the smooth streaming capabilities of IIS and Silverlight together with SharePoint becomes a great mix. Out of the browser, I think is probably one of the more interesting features of Silverlight for SharePoint. And we'll look at some of the technologies that make this a super interesting scenario, but you can imagine that in your SharePoint site, you have these Silverlight controls. And in those Silverlight controls, imagine popping those out of SharePoint and having them run on the desktop, but yet running against back-end SharePoint data and logic and stuff. That becomes a very powerful thing, and we'll look at that in the last demo. Local messaging. How many people are familiar with local messaging? So local messaging is the ability for two Silverlight controls to communicate with each other. And those Silverlight controls can be on the same page. They can be in the same browser on separate tabs. They could even be in separate browsers. You could have a Silverlight control in Firefox communicating with a Silverlight control in IE, passing messages back and forth. And how this applies to SharePoint is in SharePoint we have the concept of web part communication or part-to-part communication. And that part-to-part communication occurs at the server level where you set up this complex system and the parts go back and forth and talk. But with Silverlight, we can do that at the client level to pass those messages back and forth and to sort of hook up our Silverlight controls into a composite application, which is in essence what SharePoint really is, right? SharePoint is really a composite application built with different parts and web parts and things and menus and navigation and stuff. And so being able to have our Silverlight controls communicate with each other gives us that composite sort of framework to develop parent-child relationships and other types of applications. But another thing that really gives us is that we're not bound to web parts. So in other words, you could have a Silverlight navigation menu communicating with a Silverlight web part so that when you add the Silverlight web part to the screen, it registers itself with the menu and away you go, right? So local messaging, I think, is an important feature for part development. Rapid development is a big one, right? I mean, in the past, SharePoint development has always been challenging. And even now with all the tools, you're still developing an ASP.NET site in essence. So you're developing ASP.NET code, and you're developing XSLT code, you're developing CSS. It's, in my opinion, it's not as easy as developing Silverlight application. And so Silverlight really brings that rapid development cycle to your SharePoint development without having to go through all the ASP.NET development, without having to think about the nuances of the different browsers or the different platforms. It's all taken care of in Silverlight. And so finally, I think the design and development workflow that Silverlight brings greatly enhances how we work. And we see this in the applications that we build internally, where we have vendors or designers or what have you building the look and feel of the application. And then they can just easily hand that off to our developers who can then wire up the real logic of that application. And that really becomes a very powerful metaphor for how the applications are built. And we see this, for example, here, where we see that a designer using things like SketchFlow can very easily create these applications, hand them off to the Visual Studio developer, who can then iterate on the design and go back and forth and so on and so forth. Keep iterating over the design until they have it right, where each discipline is really working in the tool that fits them best and working seamlessly together. So bringing that capability to SharePoint is super critical. So let's take a look at SharePoint and what kind of Silverlight features SharePoint has out of the box. Now the thing about this is really about how is SharePoint betting on Silverlight? Now traditionally Office in the past has been very conservative about the new technologies that they bring on board, right? I mean, think about how long .NET's been around and how much .NET is in Office. It's not a ton compared to the time it's been out there. But the SharePoint team is really taking a bet on Silverlight because they realize the power of the platform and they believe in the platform. And I think that adds a lot of credibility for your solutions as well. I think mainly the first thing is now that SharePoint ships a Silverlight-enabled web part out of the box. And we'll see how that works in the first example. So now you can very easily just drop your ZAP file, your Silverlight application, onto SharePoint and have a running application. There's also built-in Silverlight controls, like the Silverlight Media Control, and we'll see this as well, where I can very easily surface video inside of my SharePoint application using Silverlight. Web applications, so the web applications, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, those applications that run in the browser, you've seen those, right? They actually take advantage of Silverlight on SharePoint if it's available. So if Silverlight is available, for example, Word and PowerPoint will use Silverlight as the rendering engine for those applications to give you a much better visual experience. If you don't have Silverlight, it falls back to the way it works out of the box, which is mostly just PNGs and stuff. And then the other one is the client object model. So now there's a native object model in SharePoint for Silverlight. This basically mimics the SharePoint.dll. So everything that you want to do in SharePoint is now native in Silverlight as a native object model. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but Mike Amerlin has a session, I believe, at 10 o'clock today on just this topic. So I won't touch on it too much. But it's a super interesting area. And then also we have RESTful list access. So now all your lists in SharePoint are exposed as REST endpoints. So you can use the ADO.NET services to consume that list data and then very easily surface that in Silverlight as well. Sandbox compatible. So now in SharePoint we have this concept of sandbox solutions. So people have heard of this already? So sandbox solution, I believe in your bag there's a MSDN magazine issue in your bag that you got the thing. At the very bottom there's a sandbox solution article that I wrote in there that has a lot more detail. But really this is the new way that you develop your solutions because you only need to be a site collection administrator to deploy these solutions to SharePoint. Another nice feature is that it doesn't require an IIS reset, so it's much faster to develop these solutions because you're not waiting for to bounce the box. Also, the sandbox solutions work in SharePoint Online. So today in SharePoint Online they have dedicated servers, and if you want to create a solution on SharePoint Online, you have to go through quite a long process, 6 months or whatever review, give up your first child. I mean, whatever it is, it's a hard process to get code up on SharePoint Online today. In the future, with sandbox solutions, it'll be very easy. Anybody can just upload, anybody being a site collection administrator, can upload those solutions. And the sandbox solutions are restricted to, you can't write to disk, you can't call out on the internet, you can't call to a database, right? So there's certain restrictions that the sandbox provides. But when you couple that with Silverlight, Silverlight can do all those things. Silverlight can call out to the internet. Silverlight can call back to a database, right? And so if you couple sandbox solutions with Silverlight, you greatly expand the capabilities that you can do inside of a sandbox solution. So those two things go really well together. So also, SharePoint is also creating these internal dialogues on Silverlight, like the create screen that we'll see in a second. And so if you have Silverlight installed, you'll get this really rich Silverlight dialogue. And if you don't, you get the old, pick from a list experience that you have in SharePoint today. So again, it's more about where they're taking bets, and they're looking to Silverlight for that. And then Silverlight everywhere. I think this is a key point, right? When we talk about Silverlight, it's not just web parts. Sometimes we get hung up and think about SharePoint development as web part development, and that's partly true, and we'll probably see all the examples today will be using web parts. But really, Silverlight can be anywhere. In the end, Silverlight is just an object tag. So imagine anywhere in SharePoint where you see HTML, you could run Silverlight in that spot. Web parts, navigation menus, field controls. You also see examples like, we have a book that's been out for a few years now on Silverlight 2 development with SharePoint 2007, and we show a bunch of these examples in there. But like, for example, in your web part, you open the web part and you go into the edit mode of the web part and you get that like menu thing down the side where you can set some properties. That could be a Silverlight. We show you how to make that a rich Silverlight control as your editor. So you could have rich sliders and dialogue. So in essence, any place that you see HTML inside of SharePoint, which is pretty much everywhere, imagine that also being lit up with Silverlight. So don't restrict yourself to thinking about Silverlight as just web parts. It can be anything. So here's the create screen for SharePoint that is a Silverlight application. But like most Silverlight applications, they're better demoed than screenshot. So let's take a quick look at this. So here is our SharePoint site. This is our default SharePoint site right out of the box. One of the things we can see is we can take a look at that create screen. So if we come in here, we can see that this is our Silverlight control. Hopefully it'll come up. There we go. So if I right-click, you can see that this is Silverlight, and I'm running Silverlight 4 here. But this gives us this kind of rich experience as I hover over, you know, the icons move around a little bit. I get a rich kind of visual experience as I select and filter different types of lists and things that I want to create. So the question is this available? Yes, this is built in. This is right out of the box, vanilla SharePoint 2010. So you'll get this. This is just the basic install screen that you get. And if you don't have this, then it'll fall back to the original create page that you'd have, the create.aspx page. But again, this is all rich Silverlight. One of the things that SharePoint has now in 2010 is the concept of assets. And so we can create these asset libraries here. And an asset library kind of intrinsically knows how to deal with media, which is video and photos and stuff. And so I've created an asset library already here called videos. And I've uploaded 3 videos. Again, this is just a standard document library that happens to be of a subtype of asset library. But what happens is as I hover over the item, I get this kind of rich pop-up. And I can see information about the properties, and as I hover over the next item, I can see that as well. But when I click on play, I get a rich Silverlight control built right into SharePoint that comes up. And we can see, you know, this is my Silverlight control. And so I have this rich Silverlight player that comes up, and it's not too bad. And so we get this experience where we have our videos to preview while they're in our list, so we can preview the videos. Right, and so I mean it's fairly snappy, and you know I don't have the IS Smooth Streaming installed on this, and plus this is just running off of VHD, off of my laptop. So again, this is Silverlight 4. I believe this is the beta. I've been running this for a little while now. I believe this is the final build as well that you can download publicly, the 41.1108. So this is exactly what you'll have. This actually, there's nothing specific. So SharePoint right now is building on top. They're building and testing on top of Silverlight 3, just because of the way the product cycles are. They're a little bit behind in terms of dependencies. So they build and test on Silverlight 3, but everything in Silverlight 3 is backward compatible with Silverlight 4. So even though I have Silverlight 4 on here, There's nothing built into SharePoint that says be Silverlight 4 or whatever, no. So it's Silverlight 3 is what the native, if you actually looked at the code for the create page and whatever, they're Silverlight 3 applications, and the same as this one as well. So that's interesting, right? So we have the create page, and we can see that they're integrating video. We can also see other items. So in SharePoint today, we have everything's a wiki page, so everything becomes editable. And before you'd have to add web parts to web part zones. That's not strictly the case anymore. We have this is just a wiki page where you can just type in text, but I can also just insert things inside the wiki page like a web part. So now I can just insert inline web parts, so to speak, right in without actually being in a web part zone. And so what I can do is come down here to the media web part and add this. So once the media control gets added here, put this up. So we've also we have the rich ribbon support. This is going to come up. Yeah. So we have the rich ribbon support in SharePoint now. We can also see things like when I clicked on the video, I now get a context-sensitive item off the video from here. So I have a bunch of context-sensitive web parts because I'm in edit mode, so I get the edit context-sensitive menu, and then I'm actually editing a web part, so I get the web part context-sensitive menu, and then I'm actually in the media control, so I get that one as well. And these are the properties. So in places before where you would surface these type of things inside of during edit mode on your web part, you can also now do these as custom ribbon elements inside of SharePoint directly. But one of the things I can do here is I can change the media, and I could just pick a video file. And if I do it from my computer, it gives me a browsing screen that I can browse that asset library and pick the item that I want to browse here. So here's my video, and so I can just pick. I could preview it again here if I wanted to. But then we have this rich, video support right inside of our page, and so it's pretty interesting, right? I mean, it gives the users the ability to really add this media in a rich way without having to do any work as developers to quickly get up to speed. Another thing that's interesting is that so there are a couple of things that you can do. One example is if you come out to your My Site, right? So your My Site is the place that you have in your corporation for your SharePoint that you pretty much own. So in general, you're the site collection administrator for your My Site. So you have permissions to do things on your My Site, like edit the pages and stuff. And so you could imagine users coming out here and adding things to a document library. And one of the things that we can add to our document library is a Silverlight application. So we'll just add this Silverlight application to our document library. And this is something that any end user could very easily do. Add the Silverlight application to our document library. We can put this page in edit mode. Now we see the traditional web part zones that you are probably familiar with. If we come in here and add a new web part, under the media and content category, we now see we have the Silverlight web part. And so this is, in essence, how you add your native Silverlight controls to the page. And so we'll add this. And what it does is it asks us for the location of the file. So one of the easiest ways that I've found to do this is if you come down to the site, to your item, you can click copy as shortcut. So then when you come in here, you can just paste that path in there. And this may or may not work. I don't have internet access on this machine. But this will go out and get all the weather data and bring in your weather information into your page here. So let's get out of edit mode here and see this. So now now I have this Silverlight control running on my site. and it's going to go out and get the weather data and show me the weather or whatever it is I want to do there. So very easy for users to consume Silverlight applications in their My Site or other sites, or even yourself, that are trivial to add to the site. So what we saw was really an example of how I can add Silverlight controls to my site. But in that, really, what that was a Silverlight application in a document library hosted on a SharePoint site. It didn't really have any integration with SharePoint. It didn't access any SharePoint data. It wasn't really a SharePoint application in the common sense that you think about SharePoint applications. What we want to do is we want to actually build a SharePoint application that is our Silverlight application. And the way we do that is using Visual Studio with the built-in SharePoint tools and Silverlight. We'll take that ZAP file that we build in our Silverlight application and package it inside a WSP, which is the SharePoint solution file. And then we'll deploy that WSP to SharePoint, either in a sandbox or in a farm-level solution or full trust solution. So let's take a look at how we do that. So one of the examples I have here is this application I have is a sample application, I believe. This is part of the standard Silverlight sample applications that you'd be able to find on sites like silverlight.net. I'll just run this so you can see what it does. So here's my standard Silverlight application. It's a list box that contains a couple of users. And as I click on the user, I can edit the information about that user behind the scenes. And so this is, again, the standard application it's out there on the sample site. But the thing about it is that it doesn't really use any SharePoint data, and it's not part of SharePoint. It's just a Silverlight application. Now, I could do what I did in the weather application, was copy that ZAP file up to a document library and then have the user deploy. But you really want to have real solutions, real developers, so that you can deploy, roll back, version, source control, all that stuff. So we want to keep this in Visual Studio. So the first thing you want to do is get this inside a SharePoint package. And the way you do that is, this is just a standard Silverlight project, and I want to add a new project to this mix, which is a SharePoint project. And the SharePoint project is going to do what we saw on that slide, which is package up our SharePoint application and deploy it. So we'll just create an empty SharePoint application, call it out-of-the-box deploy. And then we'll say OK. We have two choices here. The default is sandbox solutions, which should always be what you choose. It should be an exceptional case to choose full trust solutions. So you want to really think hard if you go outside and do a full trust or farm solution because of the capabilities that you get with sandbox solutions. So let's say, OK. So now we have our SharePoint application here. It's empty. We have a set for features. We have a packaging mechanism. These are kind of SharePoint things. If you're a Silverlight developer, these are kind of SharePoint things. But what we want to do is we want to add a module. Modules are the way that you deploy files in SharePoint packages. So let's add a new item. Come down here to module, and let's just call this OOB. Now, one of the things that we have here so we get a sample file that we do. And so if I F5 right now, what would happen is it would package this all up, and it would deploy my sample file. And it would actually deploy it to this location. But that's not where we want to deploy it. So let's do a couple things here. So let's put this one on here. All right. So what this is saying is, that I'm going to deploy a file This path is the path to the ZAP file as it's packaged inside of the WSP. So this is the relative path to the file inside the WSP. The second path, the URL, is the path that I want to deploy it to on SharePoint. And in this case, I'm going to deploy it to the master pages library. And I'm using basically the WebDAV path to access that when it deploys. So what I don't need is I don't need the sample application, so we'll delete that. And you'll see that it also deletes the file for me there. So now I have this ready, but I still need to get my ZAP file into my SharePoint package. Now, normally what you've done in the past is you add a project reference to another project to add that project DLL to your project. But in this case, the output that we want isn't a DLL, it's the ZAP file, it's the package. So how do we do that? We can't do that with normal project references. So the Visual Studio team added this feature in here where if I go to the module, I come out here, I have my project output references. I open this dialog, and this is not super intuitive, but it works, and so once you do it a couple times, it's not too bad. So I add a new item here. I choose from the drop-down the path or the project, which is my Silverlight project, and then I choose a deployment type of element file. This will cause Visual Studio to then say, okay, I've basically added a project reference to that Silverlight project, and I'm going to grab the ZAP file on build and then bring that into my project. So then we say OK. We close that again, and we're done. So now what I have is I have a Silverlight project, and I have a SharePoint package that will deploy that to SharePoint. So all I need to do in this case is hit F5. Actually, let's set this as the startup project, so that would work a little better. Hit F5, cross our fingers. So you can see some of the stuff happening over here on what it's doing. This one created the package, built it, deployed it. So it goes through a whole number of steps that in the past you'd have to do manually. And so it's very easy to do this. And so now it's adding the solution to the sandbox. And then it activates and we're done. Then it launches just like you would expect in an F5. It launches the application for us, which in this case is the web browser. So there's a couple of things we can look at to kind of verify that we've actually deployed it correctly. There's our video. So if we come down here to our site settings, and then we come to the solutions gallery, here we can see all of the applications that are deployed in my sandbox, and I can then see that I just deployed this one a few minutes ago. So this has been deployed to the sandbox. And then we can verify that it was actually deployed to the master pages by coming to the master page gallery. And then I think I put it here. No, I put it in the root, right? So if we come down here, we see here's our ZAP file deployed to the master page gallery. Right? So we verified that it deployed the ZAP file correctly. We got our solution running. So then all we need to do is come back to our home page. And let's actually deploy this to a new site page. So we'll create a new site page here. And again, in here, we'll insert the web part like you saw in the first example. Again, I need the path to that web part. So let me go out to the master page gallery and get that path. So now, you saw in the first example, I was able to right-click and I could choose copy shortcut. In some, I can't do that. So what I have to do is right-click, come down here and do view properties. And then on this one, I can right-click and choose copy shortcut. So then once I have that, we can just paste that in and run this. Let's set the width on this so it displays correctly. So we'll just let it auto adjust. Save our page. And so now we see that we have that we have that application in here. Let me auto adjust the height too. But we have our application running, and it was fairly easy, right? It was just a few clicks, and we can get everything running in our web page. But still, we're at a point where we're not really integrated with SharePoint. We're just hosting this in SharePoint. Let's figure out what's going on here. There we go. So again, we have our application, but now we're hosted inside of SharePoint. And we still have the same interactivity that I had before with this application, but now it's running inside of SharePoint, right? Thanks. Okay, so let's stop this. Come back, talk a little bit more. So we kind of saw how we went in the first example where we just have a ZAP file we upload to a document library and we add it as a web part and we're away. Second example, we've packaged that into a real solution that then we could add other solution event receivers and things like you saw in the keynote event, right, where they added an event receiver and other things and lists and other stuff. But now we have a real solution that we can version, we can build, we could take that WSP, we could take that project, run it on a TFS build server without SharePoint installed and get it into your nightly builds. You could check that into source control, right? We have a real project that we can deal with. I can roll ahead and roll back that SharePoint solution. I can handle upgrade events on that solution. So it becomes a real thing that you can really manage as a real application and real ALM kind of capabilities. But really to make this a SharePoint application, we really want to integrate with SharePoint stuff, SharePoint data. That's where the real value comes in. Yes, it's nice to host, puzzles and weather controls, but we really want to make business applications that are really talking to SharePoint data. And so we have really three sort of options to do this. The first one is kind of the old standby web services. That's what exists today in 2007, and that still exists in 2010. It's not the first option, but it's an option. You do have more coverage with the web services. You can do some more things, some more operational things. And web services cover all the services like search that you may not find in the other technologies. The next one is the client object model, which we talked about briefly. This is a native object model that allows you to read and write your data, manipulate web parts, do basic things like pretty much everything under the site collection. And you'll see that in a second. And then finally, the REST that we spoke about earlier, being able to get your data in RESTful ways that makes it very easy to read and write and update that data. So web services, again, not too much to talk about here. It's the exact same thing that you had in 2007, just it works in 2010. The client object model. The client object model is not only a Silverlight object model, but there's a native CLR object model and a native JavaScript object model. So if you want to do AJAX, or you want to mix AJAX and Silverlight together through HTML bridge and do some really wacky stuff, that's possible with the client object model as well. The client object model, like I said, it does the .NET CLR, so WPF applications, WinForms, Office applications can all use the CLR, the .NET CLR version. And the code is the same, so once you see Mike's talk later this morning, you'll see that once you learn it once, the code's the same, because in essence, these object models are auto-generated from the server object model. Just like you would generate a COM callable wrapper by adding a COM object to your class, or adding a web service reference, a proxy is generated, and the proxy just happens to be a callback to SharePoint. So here's what you can do with the client object model. Pretty much everything under your site collection is accessible. Things like operational things or things that you would do with STS admin are not there. But for business applications, this really covers 90% of what you'd want to do anyway. And that's really what we're focused on, is business applications. REST. So now everything is exposed as a REST endpoint, so it's very easy to use tools like the ADO.NET Services to create entities and to deal with the data in a way that makes it very transparent to you. And we leverage through SharePoint and Silverlight all of these capabilities that the other teams have been working on. All right, so let's take a look at this example. So we started with this example here, and let's take a look at the code in this example for a little bit. So here there's a contact object. This contact class basically defines the properties of a contact, first name, last name, job, et cetera, and so forth. We have a list class. We have a contacts class. The context class just contains all the boilerplate information about getting the application running. And then interestingly down here, there's the contacts list, which was the list box that you saw. And this architecture is a little bit pluggable. And so what happens here is they have a contact local store plugin already that's running this. And if we look at this contact local store, it just implements iContact Store. And then it has a deep business logic. Basically, it has two users hard-coded into the class. So we want this to really be SharePoint data, so we're going to rip out this implementation and put our own implementation in its place. So the first one I want to show you is a REST implementation. So here in the REST class, what I've done is I've added a service reference to the REST service on the site. And we can see what that endpoint is, which is listdata.service. So this is the REST endpoint for your SharePoint data. So if we come in here and look at this, we can see this returns us an Atom feed of all of our lists that we have in our system. So we can see that we have all the lists in the system, and the one I'm concerned about is the contacts field. So I could actually just drill into this and see the contacts. So now this is just the contacts list being returned as an Atom feed. And then we can see things like different names. So, so here is Fatima. She's 358, so we could come in here and do, and then we see just that record. And then just like normal REST, I could do last name, and so on and so forth. And I drill down, and I could do that through normal REST. But with the ADO.NET Services, as a developer, I don't need to know even that that's XML. I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. All I want to see is my list data, which I have here. So here's my list data that I have. So I have Guy and Kevin and Roberto. So that's my list data here, and I'm going to consume that with this REST service. So all I do is I create a new instance of the data context class. And again, this data context class is generated when I added a reference to the service. And then, so once I have a reference to that, I can handle the load event. So this is when the main application is calling my plugin here and telling me to load. And so what I do here is I begin execute on my get contacts. So I come down here, because this is all asynchronous. We're in Silverlight, right? So I call my get contacts method here. This actually gets a reference to the REST service, calls it, gets my list, and then iterates through all my items being returned, and then just builds the list with that from the collection. And then I take that and I call back to the main class and say, I'm done. Here's the data that you should populate the list box with, and that's this right here. So it's really one more thing that we have to do here. We just want to get rid of this because we don't really need this one anymore, and we want to add in the one that plugs in our own class. So let's do it this way here. So we want the SharePoint store REST. So now let's go ahead and start debugging this thing. Hopefully what we'll see is if everything goes right, we'll deploy this out to SharePoint, and then it'll actually use real SharePoint data to load up our stuff. So here we are back to our home page. We need to go to our application page here. And now we've loaded with real SharePoint data, and you can see this is all the real, and as I click on these, we can see this is all the real data coming from the list. And it was very little code, right? I mean, you saw it was maybe a dozen lines of code. Most of it was kind of boilerplate code, nothing really special. But it was very easy to do that. Now, we can also do, so that was using the REST API. We can also do it using the client object model API. So let me get this one. So to do that, I just switched my plugin to use the client object model API. Let's take a look at this for a second. The client object model API, I need to add 2 references. The 2 references you add are Microsoft.SharePoint.Client.Silverlight and SharePoint Client Silverlight Runtime. Those are the 2 references. Again, they're super small, and you'll see this in detail in Mike's talk. Once I have that as a reference, I can add the namespace. In Client Object Model, everything revolves around the client context. That's sort of the center of gravity for all programming. So I get a reference to my client context. Here I can just do client context.current because I know that I know where my Silverlight application is running, so I don't need to actually put in the path. In this case, if I'm running out of browser, I need to enter the path. Once we do that, we can just load up our list. I'm saying go get the list title. This is client object model programming, but it's the exact same programming that you would do on the server. So if you're familiar with server programming, or you go, look up something on how to do it on the server, that exact same code should work on the client in essence. So once I have that, I come back here and I pass a query to the list. In this case, it's camel, but I can also just say, hey, just give me everything. It'll generate the camel for me. But if you're really doing this for real, you want to actually write the camel because it sends that to the server. Think of it like a store procedure, right? You wouldn't want to get all the data from SQL, then sort it. You want to run that store procedure on the server, let it do it on the server, and then give you just the results. That's what the camel does. So camel's kind of a pain, but it's kind of important in the sense of efficiency and the way you get your data. So in this case, I'm saying give me everything. Now in client object model, we have this kind of SQL-ish kind of pattern, which is I build up a query, and once the query is built up, I then call the server and say, now execute that query. Well, the way you add things to the query stack, if you will, is by calling the load method. Each time I call the load method, that sticks this new query onto the stack, and then when I call execute query, it'll convert that to an XML file, send it to the server, it'll process everything, and return me back JSON objects back. And then the client object model parses that JSON and gives me just regular objects. So I don't know that that's happening as a developer behind the scenes. It just works. But that's what's going on between load and execute query. Now again, in Silverlight and JavaScript, it's asynchronous, so we have to call execute query async. Handle the callback. I get a failed and a succeeded callback. In this case, I'm ignoring the failed callback because my code always works. And so once I get that back, I can then iterate through my collection that I get back, just like I did with the REST, and then build that object collection that the original program needed in that correct structure. So in this case, you saw that the REST was strongly typed, and this is loosely typed, right? Or weakly typed. And the reason is because lists in SharePoint can be anything. They're based on content types, or you can just add any column. So we don't know what's going on, where the rest generated that proxy based upon whenever I pointed it at that site, it generated that proxy. So if things change, the REST implementation may break, where this is a little bit more flexible because I'm querying the field values collection for all of the field values that have been returned. Anyway, long story short, hit F5. We should see the exact same thing. This should be kind of anticlimactic. It should just look exactly the same. It just happens to be a different implementation and a whole different type of technology that's running behind the scenes to actually build the list. So it shows that I'm running the client server on the client side object model. And then when it loads, so it looks and behaves exactly the same as before. It's just a completely different technology and implementation and how that works. Question? How's the performance I compare the two? I would, well, in this implementation, it's probably a wash. But the thing about the client-server object model is that it's very aware of network resources. In other words, you call the server when you want to. In other words, you're explicit because I call execute query. So it's very explicit about when you call the server, and it's very explicit about what I get returned from the server. So just because I ask for a particular object, it doesn't return me all the properties. I say, go get me the list object, but only these 3 columns. Or go get me the web object, but only this property. So you can say very explicitly the exact data elements that you want. And I think over the long term, that becomes more efficient where the rest returns the set of data. So I think depending on what the scenario is, I think they have pros and cons. But there's nothing inherently slower or faster about the other ones other than kind of the structure of the data that you're returning. OK, so let's move right along here. So I think in terms of the client-server object model, to me, this is kind of the exciting part, and I think really needs people to really explore this more, because this, I think, is the killer feature, the killer combination, which is take that client-server object model, run it out of browser, and now you have the ability to have this deployment model for your SharePoint business applications that sit and run on the user's desktop. You imagine like BI scenarios where you have some charts and some KPIs and things running on SharePoint. Imagine those as Silverlight controls that you pop out of the browser. They sit on the user's desktop almost like widgets. So the business people come in, they can look at the site. They don't actually have to go browse the site to get to that thing and then find that. It's just running there on their desktop. Feels like a regular application and allows them to quickly get up to speed. And so with Silverlight 4, I think what we're seeing is that they're really going forward with this. We have the ability to change the Chrome, right? You saw that, to make it really rich. We have the ability to do full trust, right, which is huge. So now we really kind of competing in that space of WPF, where we're taking stuff offline. It's easy to deploy, but now we can call COM object. We can call office automation. We can do all sorts of things in that area. And then there's also this concept of the BCS. How many people have heard of the BCS? There was a great talk yesterday by Steve Fox on the BCS. But the BCS is basically how you connect to offline data, share SAP, Oracle, your SQL servers, and bring that data onto SharePoint. And then you can bring that data to the client. So you can imagine a scenario where your client-side application, your out-of-the-browser application, is not communicating with SharePoint, but it's communicating offline with the SharePoint BCS cache. And then you let all of the caching, syncing mechanism built into that feature to do all the data syncing for you. You don't need to manage that data sync with your out-of-browser application. So actually, so since we're running close on time here, I'll just briefly show you this example of what I'm talking about here. So let's, so let me comment this out. And now if I redeploy this application, what we'll see is that there are some features that are built into this out-of-the-browser application that will allow us to light up and do different things and hopefully give you some ideas about types of applications that you can create, because you get, auto-updating support, you get the ability to know when you're online or offline, that type of features. So now what I have here is I now have my application. It knows when I'm online or offline. I have the status of network availability. I can just run this on my desktop and install it. So here's the install experience. So I just say yes, and now it's running out of browser. And so if I close this, so you can see that this is just running here on my desktop. Let me get Visual Studio out of the way. So this is just a desktop application now, right? It's running out of browser. I can go online or offline from here. I can choose those updates. I still have all of my data that's coming back from SharePoint, but now I'm in an offline example. And if I close this application, we can see that it's here on my desktop as if it's a regular application. So to end users, they don't know or care that this is a SharePoint Silverlight out of browser. To them, it looks just like a normal desktop application. Now, coupled with the client-server object model, it becomes super powerful and very easy to leverage that data and create these type of applications. Thanks. So this is kind of a hard slide to talk about the patterns. But what we've talked about is that there's a number of sliders that you can think about when you're building your applications. So the first application that you saw was the weather app. I just uploaded a ZAP file to the library, and there was no packaging. I didn't have any data integration. It wasn't in the sandbox, and it was kind of just the web part, right? That was sort of the first pattern. Then we look at some other things in the second example, which was, well, I put it in a special location. It was still a library, but it was kind of the master pages library, so normal users couldn't delete it on me, and I packaged it into a WSP. Then we looked at the third example, which is like, well, now I'm actually integrating data into my application. And then finally we said, well, there are a bunch of different form factors that we can choose, one of those being out of browser. But again, like I talked about before, open your mind and think about these applications everywhere, whether they're one-pixel applications or whether they're a field control or whether they're a menu. Any place you can put an object tag in SharePoint, think about Silverlight in those examples. And so finally, really, the summary is that they're great together. We have the great Silverlight experience for presentation, coupled with the security, back-end, claims, data, BCS, all the features of SharePoint as the platform, peanut butter and jelly, if you will, great together. Or if you're more healthy, peas and carrots. So really think about how these things come together. Think about the scenarios that you can do these on. For more information, we have great sites at TechNet MSDN. What I'd like to talk about here is something I've been working on for the last year that we just released to Channel 9. We have 20 training units out there for Office and SharePoint development. It's done with people by Critical Path Training, Ted Patterson, and O'Connell. So we have 70 videos, 12 hours of instructions, all high-def videos you can go out there and watch. In the next couple weeks, we're going to be releasing the hands-on labs. You'll be able to go do all the hands-on labs. So download Silverlight, download SharePoint, watch the videos, run the hands-on labs when they're available in a couple weeks. We also have an early adopter program for SharePoint. So if you're a company interested in getting into the program, please ping us at that email address below, and you'll get early bits, early access, training on site in Redmond, training on site in your local area, et cetera, and so forth. It's a great program. It's free, so just if you're interested and you qualify, just come to that site. And with that, we have about 22 seconds, so I'll take some questions. No, go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I feel that sandbox solutions and Silverlight 4 have a lot of future in the platform, okay? Can I do drag and drop files with Silverlight 4 and then deploy it as a sandbox solution?
Yes. So the question is, can I do drag and drop files on Silverlight 4? And in fact, I was working on a sample I unfortunately didn't get to finish where I do exactly that, where I created a Silverlight application, put it as the header of my document library, and I could just drag files onto that target, and it adds it to my document library automatically using the client-server object model. So when I finished that sample in a couple days, I ran into a couple of technical glitches. Once I finish that, I'll post it to my blog, and you guys can download that sample and run with that. Yeah.
I have a question. There's a visual difference between Silverlight and HTML.
Yep.
So is there any style or something that can smooth this difference?
Yeah, so there's a visual difference, right? You want to make sure that your Silverlight application feels like it's part of your site, but we can get very rich sites with SharePoint. Yes, I have sort of the gray square rectangles of the default site here, and it looks out of place. But in your real site, we can get very rich sites because it's all XSLT, it's all CSS. So your sites can be nearly as rich as what you see in the Silverlight visualization. And then you can couple that with themes and skinnable Silverlight applications to really match so that when you put it in there, it fits into the environment much better. So is there an out-of-box scheme? There's nothing that I've seen so far that like apply the SharePoint theme to Silverlight, but that's an interesting scenario. But I haven't seen it. Yeah, or the other way around. But what is the default Silverlight scheme, right? I mean, it changes so frequently. Like in this example, I had like a black application, and so.
I'm concerned with accessibility.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering whether Silverlight 4 has any improvement or ways of rendering content for users with.
You know, I'm not explicit. I've looked into this a little bit, but that's not my feature area. But I know they do things like the SEO stuff. They're supporting screen readers. They're doing things like that and around accessibility. And I know they're really working hard on that feature area. If you want to just ping me offline, I can get you the exact, I can put you in touch with the guy who owns that feature.
All right, thanks.
But I know they are working on it. There was a question over here, yeah?
The project that you showed today, is it available for download or is it documented as one of the labs anywhere?
Is the project I have available? Did you get a laptop yesterday?
Yeah.
Maybe we can swap. No, I'll post it to my blog, or just ping me if you need it sooner. I'll just email it to you. I'll be down in the pavilion later if you guys want to come down and talk about anything in Silverlight or anything SharePoint related, or some combination of the two. I'll be down there. But with that, I'm a little bit over, so thank you very much, and hope you have a good conference.